I've been working as a ranger in the Appalachian Mountains for 7 years now. I've seen just about everything out here. Lost hikers, completely unhinged people, unexpected encounters with wildlife, and even a few stealthy campers who think they can sneak past us. There are days when the forest feels normal, almost welcoming. But at night, well, that's a whole different story. Especially after 1 a.m. When the darkness is thick, the trees seem more imposing. The air feels heavier, and sometimes the silence makes me feel like I'm the intruder. It's rare for the forest to be completely silent. Usually, there's some nocturnal creature stirring, or the sound of the wind through the trees. But when everything stops, when that deep silence sets in, it's truly eerie, like time's suspended, waiting for something to happen. That night, I was in a more isolated area, close to an old ravine we don't like going near alone. It's a place where there have been some serious accidents, and the steep, treacherous incline has claimed more than a few lives over the years. Normally I avoid it, but that night, I felt compelled to patrol there, almost like something was calling me. Beyond the ravine, it's a strange area where nobody usually passes through. Despite that, there had been 2 murders by the river just a couple of miles away. I was heading toward one of those spots where a couple of campers had lost their lives at the hands of a madman. It happened more than 20 years ago, but stories about that place still circulate. It was gruesome. That's when I saw them. 3 men, deep in the forest, far from any trail or authorized campsite. They were digging into the ground with flashlights angled low, talking to each other in whispers I could barely make out. I tried to get closer, staying hidden among the trees and moving carefully to avoid making any noise. They seemed focused, pulling something from the dirt with an unsettling precision. At first, I thought about confronting them, asking what they were doing out there. But a cold instinct ran up my spine. Something told me to stay quiet, to watch without being seen. There were 3 of them, and they might be armed. I noticed them pull something out of the hole, wrapped in a cloth that looked old, almost falling apart. It had probably been buried there for years. I did my best to focus and see what it was, but their flashlight beams weren't enough to make out the details. The feeling of unease grew stronger, almost like the forest itself was holding its breath. Then, the inevitable happened. I stepped on a dry branch that cracked loudly in the night silence. The 3 men stopped immediately and looked up, turning their heads in my direction. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I was sure they'd hear it. They started moving toward me, slowly, cautiously, like predators closing in on prey. I felt something I'd never felt before in the forest. Pure panic. Like I said, I'd been a ranger for 7 years, and had seen my fair share of intense situations. My life had even been in danger while dealing with wild animals, especially when I was younger and less experienced. But there was something about these men that truly scared me. In that moment, I knew I'd made the right choice not to confront them directly, or something terrible could have happened. So, I stayed crouched, motionless, holding my breath. They scanned the area, their flashlights sweeping over the ground and trees around me. Time felt like it was stretching as I waited, each second dragging out longer than the last. Finally, after what felt like forever, they gave up and went back to whatever they were digging up. I heard the shovels hit the dirt again as they kept pulling something out of the same spot. Then the shoveling stopped, replaced by the sound of footsteps. They were barely audible, as if they were trying hard not to make a sound. I carefully stood up and peeked out, and when I saw them walking off in the opposite direction, I decided to follow at a distance. They walked single file, without speaking, like they knew exactly where they were going. For a moment, I hesitated, but curiosity and my duty as a ranger overpowered the fear. I moved forward, stepping lightly to avoid making noise, jumping over a rock in my path, and then, when I looked up again, They were gone. Just vanished. I looked around, scanning every dark corner between the trees. There were no footprints, no movement in the shadows. Just the total, impenetrable silence of the forest, heavy and overwhelming. I thought maybe they'd heard me and were hiding, ready to ambush me. I stood there, frozen, waiting for a sound, a movement, but nothing happened. Slowly, I realized the only thing moving in that forest was my own breath, fast and shaky. That night stayed with me, even after I got back to the station. I told my colleagues what I'd seen, but they reacted with skeptical looks or jokes to ease the tension. But 2 days later, things got real. One of our rangers went missing. He'd gone out for his night patrol and never came back. We organized extensive searches, but there was no sign, no trace, no body, nothing. A third ranger reported a few days later that he'd also seen 3 men digging in another part of the forest. Like me, he'd thought about approaching them but felt it wasn't safe. They disappeared before he could get more details, leaving him with a lingering sense of unease he couldn't shake. After that, I couldn't feel comfortable on night patrols anymore. It was like the forest had changed, like every shadow held something or someone watching me. I stuck it out as a ranger for another year. But with each shift, each nighttime patrol, the tension only grew. Eventually, I asked for a transfer and left that post. Even so, that memory haunts me. The ranger who disappeared was never found. We never figured out what those men were digging up. And to this day, whenever I think about going back into the forest, it feels like that cold, deathly silence is still waiting for me. Hey, Horror Spectator here. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on post notifications so you're always in the loop when new videos drop. We post 2 videos every week. If you're really into this content, consider sharing it with your friends. It really helps us grow this community. Now, let's move on to the second story. I've always been a pragmatic person. I never believed in ghost stories, local legends, or any of those superstitions. So, when I started working as a forest ranger 15 years ago in a forest I prefer not to identify, I began to feel the first signs of unease. I'm not revealing where I work, out of caution, not so much for my own sake, but for safety reasons. If I mentioned the place, it would definitely attract curiosity seekers and people willing to challenge the unknown. And the last thing I want is another tragedy. At the same time, I've tried several times to speak to the police, but everything that happens here is completely hushed up. The public rarely hears about the dark things. What I've experienced in this place would be enough for anyone without training to quit, but my colleagues and I persist. Maybe it's because we're afraid of what we do outside of here. After all, for most of us, the forest still feels like a second home. Or maybe it's because we feel responsible for the lives that were lost, for the voices that still echo in our minds. Right at the beginning, when I started this job, my superiors vaguely mentioned that it was a complicated forest. They told me to be careful, but never explained what they meant. I thought they were talking about the challenging geography, the treacherous cliffs, or the sudden weather changes. Hikers who were completely unprepared, or the occasional wild animal. Only later did I realize that when they talked about being careful, they meant something deeper. Something that wasn't discussed openly. Almost a taboo among rangers. I, like any skeptic, ignored the hints and just followed the protocol. The first few years were actually pretty calm. Routine patrols, a few lost campers, animals getting too close to campsites, some people who seemed completely crazy, and a couple who I suspect were outright psychopaths. Nothing out of the ordinary for a place like this. But after a while, I started to notice a pattern. The number of child disappearances was unusual and absurdly high. At first, I blamed the parents of the missing children. I thought they were negligent, careless, people who didn't understand the responsibility of watching over their kids. But, over time, I saw there was a pattern, something that didn't make sense. These families, on the contrary, they were attentive, showed love, and had genuine dedication. It was a common trait among them, something that made the disappearances seem even stranger. I tried to investigate. I shared my concerns with the police, but it was like talking to a wall. They treated everything as unfortunate accidents, nothing more. I knew there was something there, a presence, not supernatural, but something real, physical, something no one wanted to acknowledge, as if a predator lived in those mountains. But what truly shook me was a case that happened 5 years ago. She was an ordinary woman, someone who, according to her husband, would never venture into the forest. In fact, he had dragged her along on that trip. She wasn't the type to go hiking or get lost in dangerous areas. And yet, she vanished. We searched for 2 weeks, combing every inch of the forest with the help of rescue teams and volunteers. Everyone was exhausted, ready to accept that she probably hadn't survived. But then we finally found her, and the scene was disturbing, to say the least. Finding her was eerie. We were patrolling an area when one of my colleagues motioned for us to stop and listen. That's when we heard her voice. At first, I'd swear it wasn't even her. It sounded exactly like a child. The voice was small and fragile, like a child's. But no, it was definitely her. Later, I remember her husband's shock as he kept saying that it didn't sound anything like his wife. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that hearing her sing in that dark, empty forest was the most unsettling thing I've ever heard in my life. When we heard that sound, every single one of us knew something was deeply wrong. She was sitting on the ground, alone, digging into the dirt with her hands. She had an empty, lost look in her eyes and kept repeating the same words over and over. She said the children were all there, waiting to be found. That justice had to be done. We approached cautiously, and that's when I saw her condition up close. Her hands were injured, her nails broken, but she kept digging as if that was the only thing that mattered, as if she'd been opening those holes for days. The police were called in quickly and she was taken for psychological treatment. I read every report I could get my hands on. They said her state was due to exhaustion, hunger, dehydration, that it was just a reaction to trauma. But I knew there was something more. I was convinced the children had to be in that area, so for several days, especially during my night patrols, I'd go out there and try to find out more. But I never found anything. No traces. We were completely cut off from the woman after that, and later, I found out she'd been committed to a mental institution. I tried to locate her a year after everything had happened. I needed to understand what I'd seen, to know if the words she kept repeating meant anything. I felt, and still feel, obsessed with it, with what happened to all those who disappeared. But it was all in vain. She disappeared from my life as quickly as she had entered it. I never heard from her again, and couldn't get in touch with her family. Since then, more people have gone missing. More children have vanished, and the cases have been covered up, suppressed. Again, they were treated as isolated tragedies. The frustration eats away at me every day, especially when new cases arise and we start the search. I watch my colleagues working, some trying to do their jobs without questioning, while others, I know they're as haunted as I am. Even though we don't talk about it openly, I can see the terror in some of their eyes. They know, just like I do, that something is wrong here. But no one wants to talk about it. And I keep working here, day after day, trying to convince myself for my own sanity's sake that everything is normal. I need the job. And from what I've come to understand from my superiors, any mention of these stories could put me at risk. So over time, I've learned to go unnoticed, to investigate in silence without anyone knowing. But every time a new person disappears, I wonder how much longer I can ignore what's happening in the forest.